بخير بن. It's Kurdish for welcome. أهلا وسهلا. Welcome to the Washington Institute for a discussion about the independence referendum that was held on September 25th by the Kurdistan regional government in Iraq. First things first, this meeting is on the record and we're being broadcast live, so please join us online. And of course, having said that, hello to those who are joining us remotely. Feel free to tweet and talk about this meeting and this session because we are on the record. Please extend the courtesy of silencing your phones. You can put it on flight mode, or for those of you on iOS 11, you can put it on drive mode. If you've tried that, you know why that's frustrating. You can just shake it, it will go on drive mode. And then please check out our website for a series of articles on Fikra Forum, as well as policy watches and media interviews and podcasts that cover the different ranges and aspects and implications of the referendum. Today's agenda is pretty straightforward. We're fortunate to have Dave Pollock, who just returned from Kurdistan yesterday. He went to the Kurdistan region of Iraq to observe the referendum. So therefore, we're going to get a first-hand account of that event. And then we are joined by Mike Knights from Boston, who will also join us after some introductory remarks by Dave. The question that we're looking at today, first from Dave and then from Mike, basically, what was the rationale for the KRG to hold this referendum, and why now? And the United States offered an alternative, and the United States and the United Nations and the coalition pushed the KRG very hard to cancel or postpone the referendum, but that effort failed, and would love to hear why that is. But now that the referendum is behind us, what should we expect? What repercussions are out there, both from Baghdad, but also from the neighbors, Ankara and Tehran in particular? And how this is going to impact U.S. policy, not only in Iraq, but also the wider region, and what kind of consequences can we brace for, or should we brace for? Let me introduce the panelists. Dave Pollock, who is here with me. He is the Kaufman Fellow here at the Washington Institute. He focuses on regional and political dynamics in the Middle East. He is the director of Fikra Forum, which is quite a unique Arabic-English bilingual online platform that promotes exchange between mainstream Muslim and Arab Democrats and their American counterparts. Mike Knights joins us from Boston. He is a Leifer Fellow here at the Washington Institute, and he's an expert on military and security affairs, not only of Iraq but also Iran and the Gulf, the Persian Gulf. Dr. Knights has also worked extensively with local military and Iraqi and Peshmerga forces, and he has granular knowledge of these matters. So without further ado, let me turn to Dave. Dave, welcome back.
Thank you.
Tell us how your trip was,
okay.
And what did you learn, and what can you share?
Okay. Is the mic okay? Yeah. All right. Thanks very much, Bilal, and thanks to all of you for joining us, and thank you, Mike, for being with me on this panel. I did have quite an interesting 10 days over the last week and a half or so. I started with a trip to New York on Monday, September 18th, to have dinner with President Erdogan of Turkey, with a small group of other American specialists in these issues, and followed that up with a breakfast the next day with his senior advisors, and then flew to Erbil shortly after that, and observed the referendum as an official international observer. Spent all of the past week roaming around the Kurdistan region, and was privileged also to have lunch with President Masoud Barzani the day after the referendum. And in between, lots of meetings with lots of local KRG officials and others. I got the last Qatar, I'm pretty sure, the last Qatar Airways flight out before the flight ban that went into effect in the last hour, and came back late last night via Doha, another supposedly blockaded capital, which, because you see I'm here, so it's not really blockaded. And I think that's probably, and I'll get to this in a few minutes, what's going to happen to Erbil as well. Sort of a notional blockade, but not a real one. So let me start by telling you what I heard in Erbil from Kurdish officials. Their case for holding the referendum and ultimately for independence rests today on two pillars. One is moral and the other is practical. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over this, and I know, of course, that there are counter-arguments that the Iraqi government or other governments will offer. But what I'm going to try to do in just a few moments is distill for you the essence of what the officials of the KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government, are saying now about these issues. The moral case rests, in turn, I think, on three basic ideas. One is the right of self-determination. Two is the history of oppression, persecution, even genocide that the Kurds inside Iraq have suffered at the hands of successive Iraqi governments. And three is the case that they make that the Kurdistan region has created in the last 25 years a stable, peaceful, tolerant, relatively democratic, and friendly, non-threatening to its neighbors, self-governing region that not only takes care of its own people, about 5 million of them, but also hosts on its soil nearly 2 million refugees and IDPs from Iraq and from Syria, most of them not Kurds, most of them Arabs, and takes care of them at least adequately. So those are three moral, basically, arguments that Kurdish officials give for their right to hold this referendum and eventually, in line with the results of the referendum, to move toward independence. But in addition to that, and this I think is what's new, the Kurds today give a series of practical, pragmatic arguments in favor of the referendum and in favor of independence. The basic question here is, why isn't autonomy good enough? And the answer that Kurdish officials and others give is basically threefold. Again, number one, it doesn't work. And they point to the last almost 15 years of experience with the post-Saddam Iraqi governments who agreed and who put into the constitution of Iraq a commitment to share oil revenues, to hold a referendum on the disputed territories, especially Kirkuk, claimed by the Kurds as their own, and to provide for the support with weapons, money, training, logistics, and so on of the Kurdish armed forces, the Peshmerga. And the Kurds say, on all three counts and more, failed to fulfill any of these promises to make autonomy a real working arrangement that the Kurds could continue to support. In fact, the KRG government has prepared a list to rebut the argument that what they are doing is contrary to Iraq's constitution, in which they detail 55, they claim, I think reasonably, 55 out of the 143 articles of the Iraqi constitution that they say the Baghdad government has violated in the last decade. And this is the case, I am told, that KRG President Masoud Barzani made in an hour-long conversation with Secretary of State Tillerson on the very eve of the referendum, as the United States government made a last-ditch effort to convince the KRG to postpone it. The second practical argument that KRG officials make today is that if autonomy hasn't worked until now, it's going to get even worse in the foreseeable future. The Iraqi armed forces, they say, are getting stronger and therefore will be more capable and, by all the evidence, quite possibly more than willing to fight with the Kurds in order to take back the disputed territories and to threaten the Kurds, even inside the Kurdistan region. Ethnic divisions and even hatred, the Kurds say, are growing between Kurds and Arabs, and especially between Kurds and the Shia-dominated, as they put it, Arab government in Baghdad. And Iranian influence, they say, is also growing, already strong, but growing in Baghdad, and likely in the future, unless the Kurds act now, to prevent further working arrangements with the Kurdistan region, and worse, to drive the Kurds backwards, they fear, into a situation of oppression. To sum it all up, as one official from Masoud Barzani's office told me the minute I landed in Erbil, before we had even got out of the airport, believe me, he said, we are not separating from Iraq. We are separating from Iran. And finally, the Kurds argue the alternatives that were presented to them, whether by the American government, European governments, the United Nations, or anyone else, were simply not credible. None of the alternatives, arguing in favor of at least postponing the referendum, if not canceling it altogether, gave any guarantee, and I think this is accurate, of a better result in the future. Not of independence, certainly, but not even of an internationally recognized referendum. And so the KRG decided, against all the advice of its friends and the pressure of its enemies, which was very substantial, to hold the referendum after all. So now let me take a few minutes to tell you what I actually saw in Erbil and around Erbil. I want to talk about the process very briefly, about the results, and about the atmosphere. And then I'm going to conclude with just a few minutes of analysis about what next. I was, as I said, an official observer of the referendum itself. I had free access to any polling stations that I wanted in a small group of other international. These are not official because the referendum wasn't recognized by any other government or by the United Nations, but we were duly accredited by the Kurdistan regional government and afforded transportation and security as necessary. And some of my colleagues ventured out of Erbil. I did not go with them to Kirkuk and other places in the disputed areas. And I myself wandered all around Erbil that entire day. And what I saw was orderly, competent, and peaceful. I think that the referendum, given the obstacles that it faced internally and externally, was, in terms of process, was credible and successful. There was some confusion that I heard about and some that I witnessed for people who were voting in different locations from where the voter lists had them. But that was handled, I thought, in an adequate fashion, with provisional ballots cast, with people redirected to other polling stations, and so on. The ballots were available in 5 different languages as required, one of which, Armenian, is spoken only by a few hundred, probably, people in the Kurdistan region, but they had their own Armenian ballots. They were also available in Arabic, in Kurdish, in Syriac, or whatever you want to call that language, Aramaic, and what's the other one? And Turkmen.
Turkish.
And I must say that I observed some interesting differences, not in the ballots, but in the posters that were hanging up all over Erbil, depending on which language you call your own. So that the posters in Kurdish said, "Yes to independence," Bale bo Sarbahan. But the posters in Arabic said, "Yes to the referendum," Na'am lil-istifta. There's an interesting difference. But the voting itself, I think, was quite free of any coercion or intimidation. And so now let me turn to the results. Overall, I think the results were credible. But the turnout was, from my observation and from other reports that I have, was very uneven. And those figures, to my knowledge, have not been released. I think in Kirkuk, the referendum was boycotted by most of the Arab and Turkmen populations of the city, altogether probably about a third of the current population there. I think in Suleymaniye province, the turnout was significantly less, although it's impossible to give an accurate estimate, than the overall turnout figure that's been claimed of around 75 to 80%. And it's quite likely that in those 2 places, the overall population is not nearly as enthusiastic about the referendum itself or about the prospect of independence as the majority of the population in Erbil and Dahuk and neighboring areas. But I would say that of the people who voted, the claimed figure of approximately 90% yes tallies with what I observed and with what other people in my delegation observed and with other reports that we've received on the scene. We had a very heated debate with the Election Commission the night before the referendum about whether detailed figures would be released, not just for Kurdistan as a whole, but for each province and each district, including the percentage of turnout, the percentage of spoiled ballots, and so on. And I'm not sure that that debate has yet been resolved, but I think it would actually add to the credibility of this referendum if those figures are officially released in short order. One last word about the atmospherics before I turn to what I think are the expectations and the prognosis for the day after and the weeks and months after. The atmosphere was, I would say, jubilant, but reserved for the most part. This was not a kind of crazy, chaotic mob scene. I think people, even in Erbil, are aware of the dangers that they face as a result of this referendum and the hardships that may ensue and the uncertainty that is clearly very much on people's minds. There was dancing, there were firecrackers, there were cars honking their horns, there were parades, there were flags. There was all of that. There was shooting in the air. There were lots of posters and signs and so on. But I would say that people were voting in a serious mood, not in a kind of a frenzy or a euphoric mood. And one last thing I want to say about the atmospherics is at variance, like many of the other things that I think I'm saying, with much of the media reporting about this whole scene. There's a story in the Washington Post yesterday or today that Israeli flags were a common sight in Erbil. It's not true. It's just simply false. I wandered around Erbil for a whole week. I didn't see one Israeli flag. I know that there were some in a few places because I've seen pictures on social media. But the reality is that although deep down there is a feeling of empathy between Israelis and many Kurds, this was not about Israel. And in fact, some very knowledgeable Kurdish journalists told me privately that they believe that some of these Israeli flags, when they do appear in a few places, are a deliberate provocation by people who are against an independent Kurdistan or against the referendum, not a sign of great Israeli presence or influence in Kurdistan, which does not exist. So what's next? The Kurdistan regional government says that it wants to negotiate with Baghdad, and that it's Baghdad that is now unwilling to negotiate with them. And that's true so far. But they expect that within a few weeks or months, and there are statements by the Iraqi Vice President, Ayad Alawi, just today, and there is a letter, apparently, from KRG President Barzani to Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi, recognizing, in Barzani's words, that there have been expressions, at least privately, of eventual willingness by Baghdad to negotiate with Erbil. But that begs the question of what's left to negotiate. If the Kurds voted for independence, or the people of Kurdistan, not just the Kurds, voted for independence, as they clearly did, what is there to negotiate with Baghdad? And the answer, as Kurdish government officials put it, is very clear and very important, in my view. They say that there's plenty still left to negotiate, the exact borders of Kurdistan, including, they say, even the future disposition of Kirkuk and its oil and its mixed ethnic population. They're not putting this publicly on the table, but privately, very senior, authoritative KRG officials say that they would be willing to consider compromises on that issue. Even the nature of independence, the degree, you might say, of independence, they say would be negotiable once Baghdad agrees to sit down at the negotiating table. So that, for example, a confederation is something that, again, they are not going to offer publicly as a bargaining position today, but they are not going to rule out as something that they could discuss in the near future. And in the meantime, even before these political negotiations take place, they are willing, they say, to begin a dialogue with Baghdad about practical issues, not about the ultimate fate yet, perhaps, of the Kurdistan region, but, for example, about possible compromises on issues of border security or airport control and other practical matters. So finally, I want to talk just briefly, and I know Mike is going to pick up on this, about what I've observed and how I analyze the reactions to the referendum by outside parties so far. Let's start with Baghdad.
And in 2 minutes, Dave. Thank you.
Baghdad so far refuses officially to negotiate, and it has imposed certain punitive measures. But they are very limited, and there are more exceptions to them than many people realize. For example, the flight ban, which went into effect, as I said, about an hour ago, is not a complete flight ban. Domestic flights apparently are exempted. Humanitarian flights are exempted. Urgent special cases are exempted. Military flights are exempted. And so even on this issue, it seems to me at least, the reaction from Baghdad is still not so severe as to be extremely provocative or damaging or irreversible. And I think the same thing is true of other neighbors. In the case of Turkey, for example, the border is still open. The oil is still flowing. The airspace is open. Military maneuvers on Kurdistan's borders are basically symbolic, not real. Kurdish intelligence officials told me that there's a grand total of 6 armored personnel carriers and 35 Iraqi soldiers parading back and forth between Silopi and the border of Kurdistan. In the case of Iran, similarly, although this is the neighbor that the Kurds rightly see as their greatest ultimate threat, in the case of Iran, no punitive measures except closure of airspace have actually been put into effect so far. I asked my Kurdish hosts whether Qasem Soleimani would still be welcome to visit Erbil and Suleimania and have meetings with senior KRG officials and others, as he has in the very recent past. He was in Sule 3 times in the week before the referendum, trying to convince the Kurds to postpone it, and he failed to do so. And this is the answer that I got. In one case, no answer, meaning, I guess, yeah, we'll see him if he wants to see us. And in another case, once we're an independent country, we will be able to prevent Qasem Soleimani from visiting us if that's what we want to do. In other words, for now, dialogue with Iran, not public, of course, is also, I think, a realistic prospect. And finally, I want to just say a word about the United States before turning the microphone over to my colleague, Mike Knights. Overall, the Kurds and their government in Erbil are counting on the United States to change its position in their favor, at least to the extent of opposing punitive measures against them and in favor of bringing Baghdad back to the negotiating table with them. As Karim Sinjari, the Minister of Interior and acting Peshmerga minister, put it to me, he said, so far, The relationship of Kurdistan with the United States is, quote, love from one side, unquote. And now we want and we expect and we need a little more love from the United States in return. Or, as President Barzani put it to me, yes, he said, the timing of this referendum was wrong. We should have done it a long time ago. But now we are counting on our friends, most of all the United States, not to trample the will of the people of Kurdistan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave. Mike, let me turn to you. Dave pointed out that while the majority of the Kurds went to the polls and they voted yes, and the yes vote carried the day, it was a solemn vote. It was a serious vote because the people of Kurdistan realized that they live in a landlocked region, and therefore their economy depends on the neighbors and the goodwill of the neighbors. Their security depends on the goodwill of the neighbors and on a very delicate balance in the region. So the dangers and the risks were not obviously lost to them. I think Dave painted a picture of the international reaction and the backlash being more like a slap on the wrist. Do you agree, or do you think that we should brace for more aggressive punitive measures in the coming days and months? Not a slap on the wrist, but maybe a punch in the groin. And what would that mean for the United States? Thank you. Floor is yours.
Great, and I'll just do a sound check. Are you hearing me okay, Bilal?
Could be louder.
Could be louder is better.
Yeah.
Let me test again. How's that now?
It could be on our end. Let me wait for a signal. Could you try one more time?
Yep, testing,
Please?
Testing. How's
I think
that?
we can hear you. Are we okay?
Okay.
Can we hear him? All right. Yes, we can hear you.
All right.
Yeah.
So I'll boom it out. So, well, thanks very much, Bilal. And, just for those in the audience, as well as working within the Military and Security Studies program at the Institute, I've spent a lot of time in Kurdistan region working with the Kurdish leaders and back in DC working with the US leaders on the issues around this referendum. And, I want to say, first of all, as a bit of a disclaimer, because I think you've got to talk about where you're coming from when you talk about Kurdistan. I think the timing of this referendum was undoubtedly, unfortunate. And I think that there are many domestic political drivers for why this referendum happened right now that David did not list, because the Iraqi Kurdish leadership won't necessarily want to talk about those kind of issues as the first and foremost drivers of the referendum. But in many cases, really, I think largely this was done for domestic political reasons at this exact time, to do with legitimizing KRG leadership figures, helping to rebuild internal domestic cohesion between the Kurdish political parties. And honestly, that's one of the reasons why I backed this referendum to the extent I could, because I felt that it was actually having quite a good effect on domestic KRG politics, and it was pushing people back together after a period of very, very severe division within Kurdistan. There was no help to anybody. The coalition to fight ISIS, the efforts to resist Iranian influence, or trying to keep Kurdistan as a stable and secure place within Iraq. So the referendum, I think, was quite good for domestic political cohesion. And I just want to state, I do believe in the Kurdish right to self-determination. So I'm coming from that angle. I actually come from a society which had its own separatist civil war, Britain, with the Northern Ireland Troubles, where 3,600 people were killed within my lifetime. My mother is actually from a disputed area, Belfast, Northern Ireland. Not as intense, but, not completely dissimilar to, Kirkuk city within Kirkuk province in Iraq. So, I have some sympathy with people who feel left on the wrong side of a border and the Kurds can arguably claim the Kurds everywhere have been left on the wrong side of every border in a way. So that's where I'm coming from on this issue. Now, what I want to talk about really, and it fits with your question, Bilal, is why do the Kurdish leadership figures seem so worried within the last couple of days about where things are going to head after the referendum? And it's very simply for one reason. It's because of Erdogan in Turkey. If it was just federal Iraq and Iran acting angrily about the referendum, and if it was even just the US and the coalition and the UN, we would not really be having such an intense period right now in the KRG. It's because of Turkey. Turkey over the last 10 years has been the reason why the Kurds can export their own oil, the reason why they can flout Baghdad's rules and act very independently, why they can have interactions with the international community. It's all down to Turkey. All the eggs were put in one main basket by the Kurdistan region over the last 10 years, and it had been working out fairly well. But if Erdogan changes his position on the Kurdistan region, then that is a true game changer for the Kurds. The Kurds in the early summer decided very deliberately to blindside Erdogan about the timing of this referendum and to ask for forgiveness rather than for permission. They understood at the highest levels that this was an extremely risky strategy. They understood that Erdogan in the past, with his personalized style of foreign policy, decision making, had, for instance, gone 180 degrees on Bashar al-Assad when Bashar al-Assad had ignored and humiliated Erdogan at the start of the Syrian civil war, and had plunged Turkey into some fairly disastrous foreign policy initiatives, partly on the basis of feeling personally spurned. So it was a very dangerous thing they did. But I think, and there would have been punishment of the Iraqi Kurds, even if they had not held the referendum, but merely for blindsiding Erdogan. But what's interesting is that I think Erdogan's annoyance has been doubled because of an intelligence failure within Turkey, and not the first in recent years. Ultimately, they do not seem to have expected the Barzanis to push through with this referendum almost up to the last minute, up till last Friday, when they held their National Security Council meeting in Turkey. They still thought that postponement was a possibility. Indeed, as David says, on Sunday, the Iranians within an ace of collapsing this referendum, at least in Kurdish province. And there's a great story there that will be told one day, and I'm sure I'll be one of the people telling it. But this additional shock coming at the last moment, I think, has Erdogan into a different place than he has been ever with regard to the Iraqi Kurds. He's always a backer of a Kurdish peace process in Turkey and more broadly, and it seems strange to remember that now. That is the reality. That's where he started out on the issue of the Kurds. Looking forward, I think that there is a good possibility that over the next 3 weeks to 3 months, we see Iraq, Turkey, and Iran institute a lightweight set of sanctions that are largely aimed at Kurdish leadership figures and at gaining more involvement in how Kurdistan makes its money, how it processes, sells, banks its oil, the revenue management of its oil sector, of customs charges that are levied by the Kurdistan region, for instance, potentially by setting up shadow border points inside Turkey and inside Iran for the Iraqi government so that they could take customs revenues first. I don't think Erdogan necessarily wants to hand Iraq the keys to the kingdom inside Kurdistan. He worked very hard to build leverage in Kurdistan, to build it as a subordinate allied state. But he's not going to want to give up all of that. But at the same time, I think he is going to experiment with a better relationship with Iraq and Iran on these issues. And that's going to leave the Kurds with less autonomy than they had prior to September 25th. There's also, of course, some cases whereby you can see worst case scenarios, which could set the Kurds back by a decade almost, if they are fully pushed through. Some of the things, for instance, that have been listed in Sabah newspaper in Turkey, which is, very close to the Turkish leadership, and is a place where they will float ideas. Now, I just want to say one or two things about the US interest in getting strongly involved in holding off worst case scenarios in terms of a blockade, a real neutering of the Kurdish state that leaves them with no independent revenue raising capability, let's say. Let's just ask a couple of quick questions from a US policy perspective. One, we want Prime Minister Abadi to win the next election in Iraq, or someone like him. Let's make no bones about it. I'm not US government, I can say that. So are we really making Abadi more likely to win the next election if Iraq's relationship with the Kurdistan region is broken? Will he be more likely to win reappointment if he can't count on 50 to 60 Kurdish votes? He only needs 165 to win reappointment. Is the Iraqi parliament better if it doesn't have 50 to 60 Kurdish parliamentarians in it out of 328? So that's one set of questions. The answer, I think, to those is no. We want the Kurds in the Iraqi political process because they're more likely to be allies of Abadi, even after this, than they are to be allies of people like Prime Minister Maliki, backed by the Iranians, or other Iranian-backed leaders. Second, will the Islamic State come back faster or slower in Iraq if there is no cooperation between the Peshmerga and the Iraqi security forces? We've seen this movie before in sort of 2011 through to 2014 period. The answer is ISIS comes back faster. Let's ask another question. Is it in our interests to see Iran heavily involved in ensuring that the Kurdistan region is bent, bowed, and broken after this crisis subsides? The Kurds on Sunday stood up to Qasem Soleimani when he came as heavy as he possibly could come into Kurdistan with threats and promises. They are literally now the only people in Iraq who have really stood up to Qasem Soleimani, probably way back even into 2003. Now, they stood up to us as well. So, it's not a completely satisfying outcome for the US. But, let's ask this. Do we really want Iran to play a major part in breaking this strong US ally in the region? In other words, is Soleimani the side we really want to be on on this issue? Are we really with Qasem Soleimani on this one? Bear this in mind. A couple of months ago, the Iranians went with their first offer for how they might back the Kurdistan referendum if it didn't involve Kirkuk. And that offer was a very interesting one. The offer was, we'll back your referendum if you help us to remove Prime Minister Abadi from power in Baghdad next year when the election happens. Is that really where we want the Kurdistan region to be headed? It's interesting that they didn't take that offer, even though there's no love lost really for Abadi inside Kurdistan region. They knew what was being asked of them. They knew it was contrary to US interests. They knew it was contrary to their own interests, and they didn't take that offer. And finally, do we want Russia, with its new major big investment in the Kurdistan region in Rosneft, a strong hand, do we really want Russia to jump in and be the people who might negotiate Kurdistan's and Baghdad's, the medium point that they come to on this issue? Or do we want the US and the coalition and the UN to be the people who negotiate that process? It's very clear. We want to be the people who help to negotiate that process. Now, I just released, and I think it's on the website already, a policy watch that talks about exactly these issues and what we need to be doing going forward. We need to appoint an envoy, somebody senior, who can go and assist with this negotiation. We need to focus not just on Baghdad, but also on Erdogan, as he is the key actor. We need to be realistic, and we need to take into account the domestic political positions of all these key actors: Masoud Barzani in Kurdistan, Haider al-Abadi in Iraq, Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey. Because in many ways, the intelligence failure around this election is that people did not pay enough attention to the domestic political drivers of people's positions on this referendum. And by that, I think we should think about what we're doing in the US. It's nice to issue statements in support of Kurdish independence out of the US Congress, or to write op-eds. But right now, what we really need to be doing is reducing Kurdish fear and anger. Reducing Turkish fear and anger, reducing Iraqi fear and anger, allowing the leaders in Iraq and in Turkey to take more moderate positions. It's a time to be intensely pragmatic. And that's even relating, I think, to things like the release of the election figures. Because, honestly, I like the idea of transparency in a KRG election. But when I balance up the value of demonstrating that a non-binding referendum was free and fair versus the scores, if not hundreds of people that could ultimately be killed because the results of a referendum are viewed as an ethnic census within powder keg disputed areas like Kirkuk, I think I would rather go for a little bit less transparency. And so, ultimately we need to help the Kurds and Baghdad, with Turkey on the sidelines, to negotiate a platform of a set of discussions. I'm going to re-release a Washington Kurdish Institute piece that I put out last November, which talked about how basically there's a tremendous number of synergies between Iraqi Kurdistan and federal Iraq. These could be fantastically good neighbors. They could support each other's interests and US interests and Turkish interests in the region very, very well if they work together. There's a lot to talk about, and the US-led coalition and the UN need to be at the very center of these processes rather than Russia or Iran. So I'll leave it at that now, and I'm looking forward to taking part in this discussion that follows.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, and thanks, Dave, again. As the moderator, I get the prerogative of asking the first couple of questions, so let me abuse that right away. Mike, let me pick up where you almost ended. If negotiations are the end result, if the Kurds, the KRG, the Iraqi government, the United States, the United Nations, if all agree that the KRG-Baghdad relationship can only be resolved and restructured through negotiations, then why did the KRG go through all of this hardship? Why did it expose itself to international sanctions, go against allies for a unilateral, non-binding move that is, turning out to be quite controversial? What do you think happened there? Mike?
So, yeah, I got it. You hearing me okay?
Yeah.
Great. So obviously, some timing issues that David talked about, I think, were quite operative. In any country, when you're trying to understand why they're making decisions, you've really got to get at the personalities and the life experiences of the leaderships. And, one of the aspects of what goes on in the KRG, as I've learned from personal interactions with the leadership figures there, is that some of the senior leaders have been marked by not only their past experiences with Baghdad and Washington, where Washington has proven to be a pretty unreliable interlocutor, to be honest, or at least we're unable to deliver the Iraqis. And David will have had the full list of, of episodes where we failed to deliver, the Iraqi compromises and hold them to constitutional promises and keep the negotiation process with Baghdad going. So, one aspect is the failure in the past, but another aspect is the military balance. Leaders like Masoud Barzani, the president of Kurdistan, are first and foremost soldiers. He understands that balance will be shifting in the future, and sure, time is against them. But, speaking about these domestic drivers for holding the referendum now, because, many people in Kurdistan don't think now was the exact right time to hold it. many senior leadership figures in Kurdistan will publicly admit that now is not the optimal time to have held this. I mean, honestly, you know, as a tactician, the time you really want to hold this is after the next Iraqi election, if the results go against the moderate candidates that the US and the West would back. You know, that's when Plan B of Kurdistan becomes much more attractive of an independent Kurdistan. But, you know, why did you hold it this autumn? I mean, you know, one of the key reasons is because we have KRG elections scheduled for this autumn, which could also involve a turnover of the KRG president. The KRG presidency has been disputed since 2013. It was extended with wide consensus for 2 years till 2015. And since 2015, it has been extended with practically no domestic consensus on the issue. So we're 4 years out of term on the KRG presidency. A change has to happen. And the KRG leadership knows a change has to happen. But there is a driver for there to be a major achievement, a major step towards Kurdish independence under the leadership of President Massoud Barzani. And, you know, as somebody who's interacted with him personally, it's been a life goal for him. Honestly, you know, he deserves to have seen more progress on this issue, you know, by the time he leaves office. And this was an attempt to deliver that. I think a lot of the Kurdish leadership felt that they could successfully ask for forgiveness rather than for permission from Erdogan. And I think there is some shock behind the scenes of some of the measures that have been publicly announced in places like Sabah newspaper. You know, some of the dialogue in Turkey, and it may well be bluster, it may just be threats, but it's highly personalized. It almost reminds of the pre-2007 period when some of the Kurdish leadership figures inside Iraq were viewed as enemies of the state by Turkey and were viewed as criminals by Turkey. Now, we'll see if all of this calms down, and I really hope it does. But you know, there could be a heavy price to pay, an exceptionally heavy price to pay, unless the US, UN, international coalition step in and play to Erdogan's preferences, which are there to still have Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, as an ally, to still have preferential energy deals with Iraqi Kurdistan, to still have a buffer and an alternative, and some leverage with regard to federal Iraq, in case federal Iraq goes in a different direction in 2018, a more pro-Iranian direction.
Thank you, Mike. Dave, let me be Kurdish and maximize my privilege here.
Okay.
We saw celebrations in Sanandaj in Iran.
In Iran.
We saw celebrations in Mahabad. We saw pronouncements of support from the PYD and some even in the PKK of the Kurdish referendum. And I imagine this a nightmare in Tehran and Ankara and probably also Damascus. What does this mean? Does this show that the possibility, maybe even long-term, of an independent Kurdistan that involves all of the Kurds is still a possibility?
No.
Is that just a dream? Or is this actually a worrying sign, just like holding the Israeli flags that would backfire against the Kurdish referendum? How do you take that?
How much time do I have, though?
How about 3 minutes with an opportunity of show and tell?
I'm going to answer this as sort of bluntly and simply and quickly as I can. The short answer is no. In other words, this is not about pan-Kurdish dreams or aspirations. And there are many complicated reasons for that. But the reality, I think, and I think the Kurds themselves in each country understand this, that this is about the Kurds in Iraq or the Kurds in Syria or the Kurds in Iran or the Kurds in Turkey, not about all the Kurds put together. And certainly the Kurdistan regional government has gone to great lengths to emphasize to everybody, all of its neighbors and its own people, that this is only about Iraqi Kurdistan. It is not about Rojhelat or PKK or Rojava or anything else. It is true that there are some new wrinkles here. The public demonstrations in Iran are unusual, but with all of the sympathy that I have for the people of Iran oppressed by their own government, and in particular for the ethnic minorities in Iran, even more oppressed by their own government, I have to say that these are, so far at least, relatively small demonstrations, relatively small, maybe 1,000 people at the most, and very easily contained by the Iranian government. This is not a serious threat to Iran in the foreseeable future, although an independent Kurdistan is viewed in Tehran, an independent Iraqi Kurdistan is viewed in Tehran as a strategic threat, not so much or not only because of Kurdish ethnic issues, but because of American bases that will likely be set up in an independent Kurdistan. On the Turkish side, there's a new wrinkle here also, which is, and I know this from President Erdogan, directly in person. I agree with Mike that he has taken this as an insult and affront and by Barzani, and his language, even in private, is extremely hostile. He calls them racists and tribalists and traitors and all kinds of things, nasty things. And I think partly that's because Erdogan, has deliberately made the decision that he does not expect or want any help from Barzani in dealing with the Kurds inside Turkey. Erdogan once, as recently as 2015, invited Barzani to Diyarbakir and invited the Peshmerga to cross through Turkish territory to help the Syrian Kurds in Kobani. And then Erdogan, as Mike said, he sometimes does, turned on a dime 180 degrees in the opposite direction. And last week, over dinner, I asked Erdogan, I personally asked him about this, and he said, about the Kurds in Turkey, he said, and I'm quoting him, "The days of dialogue are over. From now on," he said, "the leading party for the Kurds, or the people of Kurdish descent," as he put it, in Turkey, the leading party for the people of Kurdish descent in Turkey is the AKP. Not a Kurdish party, not a liberal party, not an opposition party. It's my party. I am the only one, Erdogan said, who can or will ever speak for the Kurds of Turkey, and Barzani's help is not wanted or needed. And so that makes Erdogan a little bit more able to indulge his anger against Barzani, but I don't think, and again, based on this conversation and many others with very senior Turkish officials, including the editor and deputy editor of Sabah newspaper that Mike referred to, I think they understand that to indulge that anger to the extent of ruining the strategic, economic, political, security, diplomatic alliance that they have developed with the KRG over the past decade would be a mistake for Turkey's own interests. Okay. And finally, about Syria. The new wrinkle here is that the Assad regime appears just in the last week to be more willing to talk about Kurdish autonomy inside Syria than it ever was before. And relations between the KRG and the PYD, the dominant ruling party, you could call it, in Syrian Kurdistan, I think, although they went through a very tense period in the last couple of years, are getting a little better. So I don't see that there's going to be trouble from the Syrian Kurds or from the Syrian regime or, in fact, from anyone across the border in Syria directly against the KRG.
Okay. Excuse me, Mike and Dave, for saying this, but now on to the fun part.
Okay.
Now I'll take your questions. We have mics. Please wait for the mic. Raise your hand. I'll acknowledge you. And please identify yourself. And please ask a question. The mics are, okay, so let me start with you, sir.
Greg Rose, formerly at the Defense Department. My question is simple. David, as you know, I've been very involved in looking at minority issues in the KRG. And in the United States,
Right.
a lot of the domestic interest here
Yeah.
is related to the treatment of minorities.
Yes.
Obviously, talking about the Yazidis and the Christians. Both sides on this issue have sort of claimed that those minorities are on their side on this. And I'm wondering if you were able to get a sense of that. Some said
Sure.
that the Christians in the KRG controlled areas that supported the independence. Others have argued because of the division that would occur in the plain
Right.
and the separation in their communities, that a lot of them are
Yeah.
opposed, although concerned about the Shiites. And
Yeah.
the broader question is about the timing. So this isn't about the minorities. You had pointed out, David, the reasons that the KRG has given for the timing. Michael, you had pointed out how the timing was ill.
I hear you. Yeah.
That the timing was ill-conceived, and you gave reasons for that. Isn't it the case that this was always going to be, it would never have been good timing to do this, in fact, and that it was sort of the elephant in the room, and by kind of getting this out of the way, forcing it into the world of the public understanding, this is what they want, that now it can be really discussed.
Thank you.
Okay, again, these are complicated questions, so my shorthand answer is about the Christians in the Nineveh Plains. I don't have enough firsthand information to make a judgment about that. About the Christians living inside the so-called Green Line, or inside recognized Kurdistan region, in Erbil and other places, I can say from personal observation, I spent quite a few hours at polling stations in Ain Kawa, the main Christian neighborhood in Erbil, and other places. I can say from personal observation, they are solidly in favor of independence. I have no question about that, and voted that way in the referendum. And about the Yazidis, again, complicated. I think that they are divided, or more divided than the mainstream, if you want to call them that, Sunni or Shia Muslim Kurds or some of the other minorities. But I think, from what I know, they were afforded every opportunity, whether in the disputed territories and still living there, or as internally displaced people in other parts of Kurdistan or Kurdish claimed territory. They were afforded every opportunity to vote freely, and they were able to do that. The security issues that some people were afraid of in Sinjar or other places apparently were not a serious obstacle. And my impression, and I can't say for sure because I don't have the public detailed results broken down by district, my impression is that they would much prefer to be part of Kurdistan and an independent Kurdistan than, not all of them, but most of them, than to face some of the alternatives, which they increasingly see as not Iraq, but Iran, the Hashd al-Sha'bi, or something like that, in their areas. Yeah. The other question you asked was about the timing. I agree with Mike. Internal Kurdish politics had something to do with it. But I also agree with you. There would never have been a good time, in quotes, to hold this referendum. And I really don't think, and the Kurdish officials that I met with convinced me of this, that holding off until after the Iraqi election due next spring would have been a reasonable alternative, because the uncertainties surrounding that are very great. Is the election going to be on time? Are the Kurds going to make a difference in that election? The Kurds that I met with uniformly argued that, number one, they can't make a big difference because it's all stacked in favor of the Shia parties and politicians and of Iranian influence already. And number two, that they will, despite the referendum, if Baghdad allows it, they will willingly participate in the Iraqi election and help as much as they can to support moderate leaders in the next Iraqi government.
Thank you, Dave. Sa'at al-Consul, left front row, please.
Thank you, Bilal. My name is Mohammed. I am representing Iraqi embassy. My question is to Dave. Dave, you have mentioned that the Turkmen and Arabs in Kirkuk, that they are a third of population of Kirkuk.
Right, yeah.
I would like to ask you from where you get this information, but I just want to remind you that Mr. Talabani, which he is Kurd, when he in his first term has give an initiative. And in that initiative, he present that, or he proposed that in Kirkuk, from each major part, we give 32%,
Right.
and for the minorities, 4%. So that it means the Arabs and the Turkmen are majority, and they have over 60%.
Yeah, okay.
Could you please?
Yeah, these are just, it's a very fair question, and these are rough.
It is very important.
It is important, I agree. And these are rough estimates, and my estimate is maybe wrong. I admit it. It's just an estimate. It's based partly on the fact that in the last 2 years, or 3 years now, since ISIS contested Kirkuk and the Peshmerga took it over and pushed ISIS mostly out of Kirkuk, in the last 3 years, the population has probably changed because some Arabs and Turkmen have moved out and some Kurds have moved in. And so it's just a guess. And I agree that it would be, what I think you're getting at is the idea that in the future it would be worth at least exploring the idea of power sharing arrangements, and certainly at a minimum guarantees for the ethnic minorities in Kirkuk. And I think that would be very desirable. And I think it's, I have to say, I understand why many of the Turkmen and Arabs in Kirkuk apparently, we don't know for sure, but apparently boycotted the referendum or voted no if they did vote. I understand that. But I think this is exactly the kind of thing that the KRG would like to negotiate with Baghdad. And I hope that those negotiations might resume.
I mean, Dave, you know that one of the disputes between KRG and Baghdad is over Article 140 of the Constitution.
Sure.
And that article stipulates, I mean, you said, I don't know several times, and there's a reason why we don't know.
I was going to say that, but I decided to let you say it.
Yeah, we orchestrated this. Article 140, which was in the TAL, the Transitional Administrative Law, 38, and then became Article 140 of the Constitution.
Yeah, it's 10 years overdue this
calls
year.
For
10 years overdue.
A roadmap so we can know. And the roadmap basically has a 3-phased step, normalization in the sense of, those who were forcibly kicked out of Kirkuk should have the right to come back. Those who were forced to move into the Kirkuk, given the opportunity. Let me not speak in vague terms. The Kurds who were expelled should have the right to come back. The Arabs who Saddam Hussein brought to the city should be given the option of going back, or forced to be going back to where they came from. And then step 2, a census, so we can know who is who in Kirkuk. And then number 3, a referendum that basically decides the fate of the city, where there should be an independent governorate, part of the Iraqi federal government, or under the control of the KRG. This was a constitutional article, and for a myriad of reasons that maybe we don't have time to get into, that article was not implemented. So today we still have to rely on guesswork. And so, yes, I think that was a guesswork by President Talabani. What Dave referred to was also guesswork, because it is very, very difficult to hold a census in Iraq, and this is still true despite toppling a regime and having a new government and having 3 democratically elected prime ministers in Baghdad and even more in the KRG. That just tells you something about the failure of both sides. And I believe that it takes 2 to tango of actually working with each other, even on an issue that they agreed to put in the Constitution. Let's move on to a next question. Let me take one from this side of the room. Yes, sir.
Hi, Roy Gutman from Daily Beast. I'm curious about the U.S. position. Yes, the rhetoric did come at the end. Yes, the phone call. But I didn't see a senior envoy going there and trying to twist arms in person, making speeches on the ground and so on. Maybe I missed that. But what I have heard, though, was a version of events that there was almost like a deal, that the U.S. soft-pedaled this at the beginning, and then a few weeks in advance of the event actually started the rhetoric up. And the deal was this: the U.S. military wanted to send arms and people and have a free access to northern Syria to carry out the Rojava, the Raqqa operation. Barzani was vehemently opposed for all the reasons we know about arming the group that he's actually at times at war with. And so the deal was that Barzani gave in, and then the U.S. soft-pedaled its opposition. Do you know anything about that? Do you have any views?
Let me give that to Mike.
Yeah,
maybe.
sure.
Mike, would you like to chime in?
Well, I don't know anything about the Syria aspect to that, and I'm not just saying that because I'm not a Syria expert. I just have not heard that be a factor in any of this. On the U.S. government involvement in this, we had a window of 3 months to act: June, July. Well, we had 3.5 really months to act. Bits of June, July, August, and most of September. Really, most of the action happened in September. And by that stage, it was too late to have the right effect. I think there were deals that were discussed. There were offers that were formed earlier in the summer that were not put on the table or kept on the table, and that that meant that we lost valuable time. And when we finally did come, we came very late in the day in quite a confrontational manner with the entire international coalition and the UN alongside. And first we went to the Quran movement and we tried to splinter them away from the KRG leadership. And then we went to the PUK and we tried to splinter them away from the KRG leadership. And then we dealt with individual parts even of the KDP and tried to work on them. When we came, I think we came as, we came in quite an aggressive manner and way too late to have any real effect. And it was a real blunder.
I just want to add, I agree with what Mike said. On the Syria part, which I do know a fair amount about, I think the premise of that conspiracy theory, I have to call it that, is just wrong. Barzani and the PYD have not been on great terms, but Barzani has not opposed the U.S. arming of the PYD, and in fact, Erbil is part, and so is Sulaymaniyah, part of the logistical and intelligence and arms delivery network for the United States to support the PYD, and that's with the full support of the KRG inside Syria. Right. No, that's actually mostly not true. Most of the time, the border is mostly open. Once in a while, there are closures, more of a symbolic nature than anything else. But that doesn't change the fact that most of U.S. or much of U.S. support for the PYD is coordinated via Erbil.
Bilal?
Yes, Mike.
Bilal, may I just on an issue of timing very quickly,
Sure.
that got bypassed earlier, or at least I had something to add. I think it's not true that there was no good time to do this referendum. In the future, like he says, it should have been done in the past. But it's that there were no guarantees of a good time being offered to the Kurds. There was no guarantees that it could be held at a better time. There is a better time to hold this referendum, and I don't think it's an academic issue. It's when we are past the Iraqi elections and past Erdogan's 2019 elections, when he needs the ultra-nationalists. And, there's a midterm point in both Iraq and Turkey where we're dealing with a second-term Iraqi prime minister who's always been reasonably open to dealing with the Kurds, reasonably open to US pressure, when there may be a better opportunity and the best time to do this. And also, the Iraqi Kurdish leadership will say to you, they are absolutely sure that Abadi won't win, that a pro-Iranian candidate will take over. Well, you know what? At exactly that moment, that's when it would be a great time to hold a Kurdish independence referendum, when the US is saying there's no Abadi to protect, there's nothing to salvage out of federal Iraq. So even by their own assessment, they know there was a better time. And they would have taken another time, a reschedule, if one had been firmly offered with US guarantees and international guarantees at a very early point in the summer. And this is not an academic issue, because this issue will recur. This is not the last time we're going to go through this cycle. Next time they won't be threatening a referendum. Next time the Kurds may be threatening non-involvement in the Iraqi elections, or not supporting Prime Minister Abadi for his second term, or some other moment where they have some leverage that they either generate or which is generated by others. And so, we need to be ready to do better next time. And we need to have laid the framework before next time through this process of negotiations.
Thank you, Mike. Bayan Khan. Front row.
I'm Bayan Sami Abdurrahman, the Kurdistan Regional Government Representative, and thank you all for a very interesting discussion. First, I'd like to just say something about the threats and the punitive actions that are beginning to be taken and that are being threatened. I hope that you're all right, that you're all correct, that this is noise and bluster and that it won't really have much impact. But threatening to close our airspace, preventing civilian or commercial flights to our airports, this will have a real impact. Our airports make money from commercial flights. If the airports are to continue to function so that they can operate military flights, humanitarian flights, emergency flights, they need to have a commercial aspect. And it's the people of Kurdistan who are being collectively punished through all of these actions. So I hope you're right that this is noise, anger, banging fists on the table, and that it won't really last. I hope you're right, but I'm not so sure, because being a Kurd from Iraq, we have seen many economic blockades and many threats, and that's the atmosphere that we've lived through.
Yeah. Let me...
And I actually have a question for you. We're told that it's difficult for Prime Minister Abadi to negotiate with the Kurds right now because he will lose face or he will lose votes. When is the right time for Prime Minister Abadi to negotiate?
Thank you very much. Can I take another question before we address them?
Please.
I promised you with eye contact to give you an opportunity, so just next to Ben. Second next.
Thank you, Bilal. And David, welcome back from Iraqi Kurdistan, as we call it in Iraq. First, it is northern Iraq. First, David, thank you for shedding light on the flights arrangements. And as you mentioned, internal flights are still going, and the international flights will return to normal once the airports are handed over to the central authorities, to the civil aviation agency, like any other country does. My question, there have been some reports that Halabja, and as we all know, it's a symbol of resistance of the dictatorship and a victim of a long term of oppression. 50% of Halabja people abstained from voting, and the remaining 50, most of them voted no. How do you see this, if these reports were accurate? And the other last question is, don't you think that holding a unilateral referendum now has created a crisis in Iraq and the region, and that could open a window for ISIS to flourish again, while Iraq, supported by the United States, and the international community is fighting to eliminate ISIS from the region? Thank you.
Okay.
All right. So, the first question from Ben Khan was about, we're talking about the timing for the Kurds, but how about the timing for Abadi to negotiate? So let's address that, and then we'll get to the other two questions that Hatem asked.
Okay. I about Abadi, and I just don't know. I'm going to plead humbly, sort of ignorance or at least uncertainty about that part of your question, Bayan.
But the question of low turnout, for example, in Halabja, but also the course in Soleimani.
I'll get to that.
Okay. All right.
I'm only pleading ignorance about one little thing.
Okay.
The question about Halabja, I don't know the results because they haven't been released, and I don't think that any of these rumors is particularly credible. But I will say this. Halabja, for all its symbolic significance as genocide, chemical warfare against innocent civilians by the Iraqi regime of those days, of Saddam Hussein, is a very, very small percentage. It's a very small percentage of the overall population of the Kurdistan region. It is not a major population center. So whatever the results in Halabja, and there may be particular local issues there have been in the past, I don't think they reflect very significantly on the overall popular attitudes or vote. About the flights, you're so right, and it's important, and to both of you, really, I want to quote a statement by the Iraqi government today, and I think this is important, and I hope they really mean it. I hope they really mean it. As you said, I'm not sure. But what they're saying today is, quote, the central government assuming control of land and air borders in the Kurdistan region is not to starve, prevent funds, or impose a blockade. That's what they are saying. And I hope that's really true. And I'm not sure, as you said. You can't be sure, but I really hope that that's true.
Sure. Let me address the question about whether this crisis that resulted from the referendum is going to impact the war against ISIS. Maybe give them an opportunity. Mike, want to take a stab at that?
I do, but just before I do, I want to say one thing about Prime Minister Abadi and when would be a good time for him to negotiate. Well, a couple months before an Iraqi election where he is going to have a tough time, even if he might be the leading candidate, is definitely not the right time for him to negotiate. No Iraqi prime minister wants to be in charge of Iraq at the point where the country breaks up, where the map is a different shape, where a number of provinces, maybe as much as a quarter of Iraq, is removed. But this is like healthcare debate in the US. You don't, what you do is you implement the cuts, but you do it so that it doesn't affect today's voting pensioners, but instead it affects the poor rest of us down the line. There are ways to actually do this kind of change. And a second term Abadi, midway through his term, with no chance of a third term ahead of him, is almost a kind of optimal conditions if you receive sufficient international support to have a grown-up negotiation about how to operate confederation or separate states with lots of economic synergy between them. On the issue of the counter-ISIS fight, you know, this kind of, I'll be really honest about this. I don't think there are a whole lot of implications for the, you know, fighting ISIS out of Hawija or Al-Qaim or any of these other remaining areas. The implications for the anti-ISIS fight are different than people are thinking about. It's not that the coalition will not be able to complete these battles with, you know, the Iraqis. That's not true. You know, the momentum is really growing in these battles. Hawija is going to go down perhaps faster than a lot of people think. And Al-Qaim is also going quite quickly as well. And these require very little direct support from the Kurdistan region, very little direct support that can't be replaced if needed. But a couple of things are important. One, if Iraq and the and the Kurdistan region are on exceptionally bad terms in the future, we will see, with an absolute certainty, a strong recurrence of ISIS within the disputed areas and along that disputed front line. This is exactly the way it happened from 2011 to 2014. They're like cockroaches. They like to find the cracks and the dark places and the creases, and that's where they come back the fastest. So we're going to be doing this nonsense all over again unless we ensure that federal Iraq and the Kurdistan region have the tightest political and security cooperation going forward. The other thing that this crisis does over the referendum is that it distracts key leaders at just the wrong moment, and it breaks lines of communication between leaders and things that they wanted to negotiate. And, you know, for the leaders involved, this is very frustrating, obviously. They're trying to focus on finishing off ISIS, but, you know, instead they're sitting down talking to people about the Kurdistan referendum issues. Well, you know, that's tough for them. But, you know, this is symptomatic of where we're going to be in Iraq going forward, which is that we might only be wanting to think about finishing off ISIS, but we're going to have to, and we always should have been, thinking at least as much about a raft of other issues, such as Baghdad KRG negotiations, reducing Iranian influence, economic issues, and so on and so forth. Iraq has always been a multifaceted challenge. You know, we've just been a little focused on the ISIS part of it. But let's put it this way. If we had started backing Baghdad KRG negotiations a year and a half ago, would we really be in this situation now? Would the Kurds really have held an independence referendum if we had strongly backed everything that's there in Article 140 of the Iraqi Constitution a year and a half or 2 years ago? We'd be 2 years further down the line at a time when the international coalition had quite a lot of leverage. But we couldn't be bothered to do that because we were too focused on ISIS and because we didn't want to put a lot of bandwidth into this issue. We always should have, and we should now, so that the next time this happens, we've actually been working on it and thinking on it and creating progress on the ground before we get to this kind of point where people have to take desperate steps like hold a referendum.
I think that was an excellent point. Thank you, Mike. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Let me take one from the back row. Then we'll see how much time we can squeeze in for maybe one or two more. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Sinan Jiddi, I'm the director of the Institute of Turkish Studies at Georgetown University. I guess my question is more towards Michael, but if David would like to weigh in, that would be great. And the question is, to what extent can we appeal to Erdogan's ability to be pragmatic, as Michael suggested, in finding a pragmatic way for Erdogan to cooperate and accept this referendum vote, given where Erdogan's coming at this from? I mean, and you've alluded to this, but Erdogan and Turkey's position, and I use them interchangeably now because it is all about Erdogan, it's not the Turkish Foreign Ministry. Up until Turkey has a presidential election in 2019, its entire approach to foreign policy is from the perspective of how Erdogan gets a bump in the polls. He's not looking at this from a perspective of regional policy. You know, he's willing to pick a fight with the United States to get a bump in the polls, 1 or 2%, if that plays to his domestic constituency. I cannot see any avenue whereby Erdogan's going to be convinced that cooperating with the KRG and giving them a break is going to help him. His entire domestic coalition is built upon lambasting Kurds as much as possible, whether it's in northern Iraq or whether it's in Turkey. And if it's as grim a scenario as that, does the KRG have any sustainability or viability without Turkey's cooperation? Thank you.
You want to take
So real quick on that, and I won't take long on this, guys. But first of all, he has basic interests inside Iraqi Kurdistan that he can be reminded of the more he calms down. I know that what you're saying is right. The military and the ultra-nationalists are much more of an influence on him than they were in the past, and he has genuine grievances, Erdogan, that this relationship with the KRG has not been quite as lucrative politically, militarily, or economically as he hoped it would be. But the first thing one could do is to go quiet on Kirkuk, go quiet on anything that smacks of expansionism, go quiet on independence. Hard to do in the aftermath of this referendum, but vital to do. The second thing that the second interest Erdogan can be focused on is the interest that I'm sure Putin was focusing on yesterday, which is the gas one day. That sounds like a very niche issue, and why does Erdogan, this sort of politician, really fighting for his survival? Is he really thinking about Turkey's role as an energy hub going forward? Well, yeah, probably not. That's not at the front of his calculations at all. He's a political animal, not an economic, crusader. But nonetheless, gas, a relationship with Russia, doing what Russia wants, I'm sure that's going to be a factor here. And I hate that because, that hands more influence to Putin. The third thing, though, the thing where Iraqi Kurdistan and the US and the Turkish military can cooperate on, and this is a painful thing, I think, probably for many people to think about, but it is on the PKK. The Turks went into this relationship with the Kurdistan region in late 2007 because they were fed up doing military cross-border operations into northern Iraq, into Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, to come after the PKK. They could see no end in sight to the war that way. They knew Kandil in Kurdistan region was the perfect hideout for the PKK. And I remember me and David were in Kurdistan region, just a few months after that, when the last attempted Turkish cross-border operation was cancelled, and a new era in KRG-Turkey relations began. That can be offered again. One of the problems of the last few years is that the KRG has delivered so little in terms of restraining PKK operations coming out of the Kurdistan region. Now, that is easier said than done. The PKK are tough hombres, and they're living right there with you inside Iraqi Kurdistan. And they're other Kurds, and they're popular. But, when it comes down to it, if you're going to have a strategic relationship with Erdogan, where he holds all the levers, I think, we've really got to, if you're Kurdistan, you've got to provide a lot more than you've been providing. You've got to show the Kurdish leadership that PKK figures can't go and have hospital treatment in KRG hospitals. No, they can't go fly out of KRG airports. You've got to really isolate and put pressure on the PKK. If I was a Kurdish leadership figure trying to calm down Erdogan and restart our direct bilateral relations with him, the first thing I would be doing, and it sounds terrible, but I'd be offering some, PKK heads on a platter, because that's the one thing that's going to turn the head of the military, the ultra-nationalist, and Erdogan himself right now.
Let me chime in with a softer approach to this. To the extent that Erdogan is mainly concerned about his domestic political fortunes, he does need, and I know that he does take into account, as I said before, the issue of how many votes is he going to get from the Kurds in Turkey, or the people of Kurdish descent, as he calls them, in Turkey. And if he goes really crazy against the Kurds in Iraq, the KRG, he's probably going to lose a lot of votes in the Kurdish communities around Turkey that he might otherwise win. And the Kurds are 20% roughly of Turkey's population. The MHP, the ultra-nationalist, fanatically anti-Kurdish party, even granted that many other Turks are also anti-Kurdish these days, that's not 20% of the population. So it's maybe 10%. So the balance of even his domestic political interest, it seems to me, would take into account that a drastic turn against the Kurds in Iraq would not be a good thing for him.
And I would add, not only for nationalistic and like ethnic, loyalty reasons, but also for economic reasons.
Yeah,
because
sure.
yes, the KRG's economy depends on oil being exported through Turkey, but much of the money that the KRG makes by selling oil ends up buying Turkish goods and services. There are thousands of Turkish
Yes.
companies operating in Iraqi Kurdistan, and of course, being a petro-state, you import almost all of your foods and yogurts and vegetables, and that has actually helped.
Even water.
Even
bottled
bottled water, and that has helped the Turkish economy, but geographically mainly on the southeastern side, the Kurdish populated side. So that's probably how the KRG is thinking about balancing the overwhelming leverage, economic leverage that Turkey has over the KRG. Now with that, our time has come to an end. I'd like to be respectful of your time. Please, let me plug in our analyses on these issues. An excellent policy watch that came out today by Mike Knights. I have another one that came before the referendum looking at scenarios. We also have 2 podcasts about this issue. Again, Mike Knights and myself. And then Dave's Fikra Forum issued, I think, 7 articles about, looking at the referendum from very different angles, for, against, pros and cons, both the American voice, Iranian voice, Turkish voice, etc. So please check our website and check our Twitter as well. With that, I thank you very much for coming. I hope you enjoyed this panel, and please join me in thanking Dave and Mike Knights.
Thank you.